I'd like to invite Ambassador Pavan Varma, former Member of Parliament Rajya Sabha, National General Secretary and National Spokesperson of JDU, and Shoma Chaudhary, award-winning Indian journalist, editor, and political commentator. Please give them a big round of applause, everyone.
Good evening, everyone. As we just said, that I'm one of the co-founders and directors of Algebra, the Arts and Ideas Club. It's a platform for conversation and dialogue for live audiences, much like this. It cuts across politics, economy, cinema, the works. We do it in 4 cities. I was asked to make a pitch. I noticed everyone's making a pitch. If any of you are interested, look it up. It's called algebratheclub.com, and we'd love to have you on board as members. But the reason we're here today is that in many ways we're going to talk about the core constituency that all of you deal with. I have an interesting anecdote to share before, introducing Pavan and the session. A couple of years ago, maybe it was 4 or 5 years ago, when Zara first opened in Delhi, I used to be the managing editor of Tehelka, and we sent some journalists out to look at the kind of excitement that there was around the opening of Zara. And they interviewed, there were lines the entire night for the opening. And at the front of that row, there was a young boy who had been waiting there for almost 12 or 14 hours for the doors to open. And when the journalist asked him why he had done that, why he was standing at the entrance of the Zara, entry door, he said, "I wanted to be here when history was made." And I think that's a great insight into the psyche of the middle class that we're going to be talking about. The Indian middle class is the big sort of demographic bulge, the excitement that multinationals and countries across the world, analysts across the world are praising. But I'll just share a few quick statistics, which is that in the last couple of years, the top 1% of this country went from 48% of the wealth to 58% of the wealth, whereas 50% of this country only has 2% of the wealth. There was recently railway jobs for 2.3 lakh jobs. There was 2.3 crore people who applied. Of all the engineering graduates that come out, only 20% are employable. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with facts like this. So the 2-3 questions that one wants to address is, what is the nature of this middle class? And going from the anecdote that I just shared with you, what is the psyche of this middle class? These are questions that Pavan has really looked at 2-3 times through books that he has written and published. The first one being The Great Indian Middle Class in 1994. And then he wrote 97, and then he wrote another book called Being Indian, and most recently in 2014, The New Middle Class. So he's really been observing this section of society, analyzing its psychoscape as well as its desire for consumerism and what it all boils down to. As all of you know, Pavan himself is an extremely eclectic man. I could share his bio data. You could do the KYC on him, but that would be boring and long. Of course, he's been in the foreign services. He's a diplomat. But what's a much better way of talking to him or introducing him is to tell you that today he could have been talking about Ghalib. He could have been talking about Krishna. He could be talking about Adi Shankaracharya, the Indian middle class. He could be telling us deep secrets about Mr. Modi and Nitish Kumar, or he could be telling us deep secrets about Delhi's social life. So all of those go into the CV of Pavan Varma, and it's a great honor. He's an autodidact, a polymath, and it's a great honor to be speaking to him today. Thank you for being here, Pavan. So Pavan, as I said, you've really been analyzing this class of society for almost 30 years now. And this is an audience that engages with with the Indian middle class in many different ways. What would you pinpoint as being 3 core attributes of the Indian middle class which distinguish it from the middle class in perhaps any other country in the world?
Well, thank you, Shoma. First of all, it's important to understand what the middle class is in the Indian context. Do you judge it only by its income? Or do you judge it by criteria which are specific to a country like India? In my opinion, any person above the line of poverty, which is easily verifiable, and any person above the line of very rich or affluence, they all form part of that swathe called the middle class, from the lower middle class to the upper middle class. Now, if that is the criteria, and broadly it is because there are many unifying factors to this large swathe which make them part of one relatively easily identifiable cohesive group. And if that is the criteria, above the poor, below the very rich, then we are talking of very large numbers. We are talking, for instance, any household where the monthly income is between rupees 20,000 to 1 lakh a month, cumulatively, with multiple members of a family working. In a sense, they constitute the middle class. Anyone who has a dwelling unit, resources for 3 meals a day, access to some primary health care and transport, and something extra to buy more than what is absolutely necessary, like a watch, a cycle, a scooter, a fridge, a cooler, already belongs to this middle class. Now, what that is in terms of its size. So first attribute, it's a very large class. According to McKinsey, and this was done some years ago, even by the criteria of income, which is say 25,000 rupees a month to 1 lakh, you would place it in the category of about 300 million people in India today. And it is predicted that by 2025, this class would be anywhere close to 600 million people, if not more. So you're now talking of a very large class. Secondly, because of this, today the middle class has acquired a certain critical mass. It's not something which is on the sidelines of the way society is moving, as it was, for instance, in 47, a small, isolated, relatively marginalized, perhaps more powerful than its numbers, but actually an animal with a critical mass that cannot be ignored. Secondly, it's now pan-Indian in scope. In other words, you will find the same traits of the middle class in this very large middle class almost across India, be it the ubiquitous salwar kameez, or the choice of a particular song, or the aspiration for a particular consumer item. There is a certain pan-Indianness to this class which is marked by a newfound homogeneity. In other words, there are people who can come from Thiruvananthapuram or they could come from Shillong. But if you belong to the middle class, you will have areas of commonality which give you a certain homogeneity which transcends your being
regional
rooted
identity
to a certain area or caste or locality by itself.
So Pavan, if you were to talk about the size and the homogeneity as the broad sort of physical contours of this class, it's very interesting that in all your books, when you've been looking at the psychoscape of this class, you had identified 2 or 3 qualities which are interesting because they're both positive and negative. And at the heart of it, you said, one, there's a hypocrisy that lies at the heart of the middle class. And the second question, which all your books address, is how to turn this class of people into a kind of enlightened class, because there is no sense of morality, no identifying with anyone except themselves and their material comforts. These are very interesting attributes for you to be examining, but you look at it both as positive and negatives. Can you talk about that? And what is this hypocrisy that you say lies at the heart of this class?
I wouldn't use the word hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is there in any class, which is the proclivity for excessive morality where somebody else's misdemeanors are concerned, and generous forgiveness for your own mistakes. I mean, take corruption, for instance. In the drawing rooms of the middle class, there will be usually very vociferous indignation expressed about corruption in high places, But very often the same people have in the course of the day not hesitated for a moment to pay 100 rupees to a policeman to avoid a challan, or to have pushed a particular file in an office a little faster by paying a little bribe. So there is, I've often said that Indians as a whole are harmonious schizophrenics. Uh, they live in two compartmentalized worlds where the two need not necessarily conflict with each other in a manner to create any systemic breakdown within you. So you can be exceptionally honest in terms of other people's culpabilities, very critical in terms of other people's dishonesty, completely complicit with regard to your own deviations from the code of ethics. These are not common only to the middle class, but in the middle class it shows more because the middle class has more opportunities to be articulate, to be heard, to be opinion makers. So in that sense you hear about it more. My book, my main book was critical about the middle class's relative insensitivity to anything which is not part of its immediate ken of interests. In other words, for instance, in our country, we have the largest number of the unacceptably poor in the globe. We have largest number of malnutrition children in the world, more even than sub-Saharan Africa in per capita terms. We have the largest number of people who even today cannot read or write. They are all part of the same country of which you and I are on the track towards upward mobility. The middle class tends to sometimes be very insular. In other words, it genuinely believes that it has been, in a sense, left out of the national discourse. The poor have their constituency, the rich don't need one. The middle class is marginalized on the sides, but actually the middle class is the single largest beneficiary of almost every aspect of economic growth in this country, although it perhaps is the one that complains the most. Now, the middle class believes that its interests are synonymous with that of the country as a whole in every respect. And therefore, you will find a situation which sometimes, it does not anymore pierce our skin. But being earlier a diplomat, when I used to interact with foreigners who were posted here, diplomats posted here in India, they would say to me sometimes, and it was the common refrain that, such an intelligent people, it's a pleasure to interact with them. And then some of them would say, there's one thing we don't understand. We don't understand how well-to-do Indians don't notice poverty. In other words, it's right there before them.
So in fact, it's very interesting, Pavan, that...
and they don't see it. That's the point where I was talking about middle-class social insensitivity, where they actually believe, I'll just complete, this is easy, except in fantasy. You cannot build normally the first floor of a house without the ground floor or the basement. The middle class actually believes that that can happen, that there are two republics of India. One is the republic of the Indian middle class and upwards, and another republic which is best, if possible, not seen at all. If you can somehow make them disappear with a magic wand, it would be better. But the real problem is you can't secede to form your own republic. You have to be part of the same unity which is called your country. And therefore, perhaps it's in the interests of the middle class, without diluting its natural appetite for the good things of life, for moving upward, for having this great entrepreneurial energy, this great desire to move on with their lives, to move on generationally from one step to the other. With all of this, perhaps a greater sensitivity also to the fact that India still remains a country which has the largest number, perhaps, of new billionaires and still the largest number of the poor.
Yeah, it's like that statistic we just shared that 1% of India's wealth has gone up from 48% to 58% in just the last 2 years, whereas 50% of the country owns only 2% of its wealth. So that's really a stark statistic on disparity. But Pavan, it's very interesting. When you were talking about the absence of sensitivity in the middle class, the sociologist Dipankar Gupta has this phrase called intersubjectivity. That the really defining idea of the middle class is, can you enter anyone else's shoes? And the fact that the middle class thinks of itself as modern, as a consumerist class, as part of a global society. But what really sets it apart, and would you agree with this, is that unlike a really modern class of people or modern section of society, it is unable to enter anyone else's shoes. So this is not really a very modern class of people. There's still a very patriarchal relationship between the middle class and the working class. Is this a fair criticism of this class?
No, I think that one of the great strengths of the Indian middle class is that it is, where its own interests are concerned, very capable of adaptation. And that is why I tell you, Indians make exceptionally resilient entrepreneurs. Even though they speak about the spiritual halo around them and talk about transcending materialism, in reality they have their feet on the ground and their eyes on the balance sheet. And even in situations of great adversity, they make good businessmen. If I may share an anecdote with you, I was once, when I was working in the Ministry of External Affairs as Joint Secretary Africa, going to the African Union Summit in a place called Ouagadougou. So I happened to mention it to a friend of mine that I'm going to Ouagadougou. He said to me, same to you. And in any case, in Burkina Faso, what I've discovered, otherwise a lovely country, I discovered that, and at that time I was writing a book called Being Indian, which also examined traits of the middle class. I discovered that the largest department store in Ouagadougou is owned by an Indian who had come penniless to Ouagadougou 4 years ago. So I went to see him. I spent time with him. And he said, yes, for reasons beyond my control, from another country in Africa, I had to move to this unknown country. But having stayed here, I learned where the opportunities lie in terms of commercial success. I used old contacts, built new ones, and built an empire to create what is the most successful and largest multi-story department store in the capital of Burkina Faso. So, as far as adaptability goes, the Indian middle class is capable of great innovation,
Sure.
of great adaptation.
So, Pavan, in fact, your book also speaks about the compressed energy of the middle class, but it's interesting today that you're somewhat hedging your bets about describing the middle class, because in your book, there's almost a kind of anger about the absence of morality on this class. And you say that it was very different during the Nehruvian era. Then the 1991, watermark released a new kind of energy in the middle class. And I'd love to ask you, possibly post-2014, as Mr. Modi has now described the new middle class, that what is...
He hasn't, I have.
Okay. Like I said, we'll get to know about the...
New book, so that's why.
Yes, this is the new middle class. He called it the neo middle class. Was this before he described?
Before.
You come before Mr. Modi? Yes, okay.
Not after.
So what is the description of the new middle class and what separates it? So if you really look at these three watermarks, again, very quickly, can you describe what the middle class was in the Nehruvian time, then post-91 and then post-2014?
My father's time, the sheer ideological legacy of the freedom struggle and of stalwarts like Mahatma Gandhi and Nehru was such that it held the middle class in thrall and almost against their will made them part of a system which had certain values which were in some manner correlated to ethics. there was a little disdain about the pursuit of materialism only. There was some sense that a good education is as good of whether you are the first person to buy a particular consumer object or not. There was some emphasis, a premium placed even on self-denial. There was some leverage about living simply. These were all the legacies of the
simple
freedom
living, high
struggle.
thinking, yeah.
Yeah, it was a kind of thing like my father belonged to the then ICS, but he would look down upon buying a transistor. He would say, well, the others who buy it, I mean, send the children to good schools, let them learn, that kind of a thing.
And then,
now that began to change because I'll tell you, the denial, the ability to say no to material gratification among Indians as a whole is very low. And that is why Gandhi's example was essentially unemulatable in India. And that is why you had successors even in politics who wore khadi, but lived and reveled in great luxury. Because it is not part of our psyche or ethos. Even the four worldviews of Hinduism have never said no to material well-being, dharma, artha, kama, moksha. Artha stands for material well-being. In fact, it is your ordained duty during a bulk of your life to pursue that material wealth without any notion of guilt, provided, and that is where dharma comes in, most of it, if not all of it, is acquired by means which are not entirely unethical.
so
So therefore, there is a porousness to wealth. If that was not the case, I cannot see how India is slated to become, in the next 10 years, the fifth largest consumer market in the world, overtaking Germany.
but so Pavan, that's
People want to buy, people want to move upwards, people covet goods. People have a choice, they are spoiled for luxury, they are very discriminating buyers.
so that, you've been making that point about it being interested in the material. So the question is really, what is the distinctive quality of the new middle class now? If you're saying that this has been the dominant nature of the middle class, at least from 1991, what would this audience, which is as HR heads, as really dealing with human resource, what insight can you give them into the new middle class? It's very interesting that the UPA government, the 10 years of the UPA government, in fact helped create this class, but they did not understand the psychology of this class, which Mr. Modi did.
Share with you one
So
thing
what is the distinction?
of the strategy of Narendra Modi ji when he was planning for the 2014 elections. I know this from first hand. And his strategy had to be successful because he had to first, in a sense, hijack the BJP itself for the top post within the party and then win a national election. And I can tell you that his strategy was not what you would normally believe, to appeal first to the poorest of the poor, to have that as a backing. His strategy was to first capture the imagination of this pan-Indian, large, critically spread out middle class who were opinion makers. Now, in this sense, what has changed after 91 is the size of the middle class, its aspirational energy, its porousness to every possibility which can grant to it upward mobility. And that's something that all corporates have to be aware of. There are few classes in the world where in order for anyone to succeed and to reach the next rung of the ladder, there is so much competition as there is for the middle class in India. For every, they used to say in the last days of the Mughal Empire, yak anar sad bimar. One pomegranate, 100 ill men. So there are people, all of them working to seize the same opportunity. And yet the middle class has that intensity, that passion, that devotion, the single-mindedness, the focus, the desire to move ahead. Now that is something new. But the middle class wants someone else to do it for them. Not in any way diluting its own efforts in terms of its enterprise and energy. I call it the Messiah syndrome. The Messiah syndrome is that the middle class will wait rather than wade into politics itself. Will wait for someone to come who gives the impression as convincingly as possible of being that strong leader who will work for middle class interests. And the middle class will be loyal to that person so long as that Messiah works for its interests. It's very, very interesting in this context what happened during the emergency in 1975. The same middle class which was exceptionally critical of Indira Gandhi in the years leading up to the declaration of the emergency was the same class which became the greatest admirers of the imposition of or the suspension of democracy, because it felt that by doing so, the unwashed masses will be kept at bay, and certain things which the middle class thought are good for itself, even superficial ones like trains running on time, better law and order, a strong dictatorial rule, dande ka zor, ye sab bahut ho gayi democracy. All of these appeal to the middle class, and where they were asked to bend, they crawled. So there is this propensity in the middle class for a Messiah. And the second weakness or proclivity of the middle class is to believe that this Messiah will also have a magic wand. In other words, he will come riding on a white steed and also have a magic wand by which all the issues that are of concern to the middle class will be rectified, while the rest of the country can literally stand on the sidelines and watch. Now, what happens when this doesn't happen? The middle class's loyalties are also very fickle. They buy a consumer product, it doesn't appeal to them. If they have a choice, they'll make a change. The loyalty elements are quite low because there is a utilitarian factor to it. The same thing applies to leadership. A political party appeals, the middle class believes that this party will cater to its interests. So long as it thinks it does, that person has its fealty, its loyalty. If it's not, that loyalty is agile, because the middle class itself is looking not for the person, although they need the Messiah. They are looking for an opportunity to continue to have a system working in its own interest in order to move faster up the track of upward mobility. You have to understand how the system is operating on a pan-Indian scale.
Sure, Pavan. So, the point I've been kind of pushing, and we'll sort of wind up quickly and open it up to the audience, but is that, you've been saying that it's material, it looks out for its own self-interest, it has this relationship with the Messiah and the magic wand. But the interesting question is that, has this new middle class, the young, restive, animal spirits, new generation, has their relationship with power changed? Even back in 1991, the kind of relationship that the middle class had with power, has that shifted? Is this new middle class got a different idea of power and leadership and its relationship? That's one question. And the second is that, has the nature of that aspiration also changed? Just in the way that, say, earlier political parties could create a sense of patronage this new generation cannot stand an idea of patronage, you know. So just in sense of, do you think there's any distinctive?
Can you explain yourself that the new generation cannot stand the idea of patronage?
Well, you know, the idea of daan, that someone is giving you something, they really feel that it is their right or they have earned it. And I think that political language, again, Mr. Modi understood it, whereas the Congress didn't, in terms of the languaging of it is your right, we'll make you stand on your own feet, you know, you can earn it. There's that.
I mean, let's get to the chase. And that is, all Indians, including the middle class, are exceptionally sensitive about where power lies. Don't fool yourself on this question. And they will adapt and adjust to a point, usually, which they would not admit to themselves in order to adjust to that power. It happens in our lives daily. That's why we like to outsource idealism to somebody else. Mahatma Gandhi, please come, fight the British, we are with you. But let us get on with our lives after we've attained our goals. So the middle class's proclivity, and I'm not trying to be critical, I'm trying to be honest because I belong to that class myself. It's to outsource idealism. But where power is concerned, you'll be amazed that it makes no difference. I'll give you one, if you allow an anecdote. When I joined the Foreign Service, and this is mentioned in one of my books, this incident, I was posted in a place called Anantapur for 4 months because I had joined the Foreign Service, and in the Foreign Service you had to be sent for district training, which is to understand the grassroots of your country. And if you came from the north, you were sent south, so I was sent to Anantapur in Andhra Pradesh as assistant collector. Now in Andhra Pradesh, which is quite feudal, collector is God and assistant collector is demigod. So anyway, I was straight out of college, I think 22, 23 years old. And I had been given a motorcycle from the drought-prone relief funds, which I used to drive, and there was nothing to show about me that I was an assistant collector. Anyway, one day coming home for lunch, a cycle emerged from a basti near my official residence, and I had a little accident with that cycle, nothing really serious. The person just fell off the bike. But that person happened to be the local constable, the police wala, the daroga. And he had no reason to believe I was the assistant collector. So he got up and he began to abuse me roundly in Telugu. And although I didn't understand Telugu, normally you understand you are being abused irrespective of whether you know the language or not. So I was standing there quite sheepishly as this policeman continued to abuse me, but by some miracle or coincidence, my peon, what they call in government of India, peon or chaprasi with his billa, came on a cycle from behind. Now what happened is like this, it all happened in the flash of a second. This particular constable had already a fully lush expletive or abuse already formed on his lips. He could not stop that. But even as he was about to utter it, the peon told him, I am the assistant collector. So the two things happened simultaneously. Abuse. So whatever, I don't want to name that gali, it came out while the right hand went up in salute. So we are adaptable.
The gentleman who gave us the demonstration about the mobile phone earlier, I wonder how he would explain that. You know, which circuit was getting short-circuited. You know?
So Indians know how to deal with power. They adapt to it. If there are resentments building inside, they will not show it immediately in a way that hurts their interests directly, but those resentments now, today, in the middle class. The middle class has been strengthened, Shoma, and I want to add this point. It has been greatly strengthened by the communications revolution. The size has gone up. The pan-Indian footprint has gone up. And the revolution in communications has connected this class and given it the power to communicate in a manner which it has never known ever before.
Yes, but how is that, Pavan, we'll have to do it very quickly because we're running out of time. How has it changed it? Yes, it's connected people, but you said,
so
how has it strengthened them or changed them?
I was coming to this point. So if there are resentments which would earlier be just swallowed and remain relatively isolated, the communications revolution has given them a platform to coalesce together and in a way reinforce each other's or more of these resentments.
So just last question, Pavan, which is that, you've, in your book, as I said, you've been addressing this question about, is there a way to make the middle class more socially engaged, to make them more morally aware? And you've spoken about the middle class being a consumerist class, but in many societies, it's the middle class that really shapes society. Is that so in our country? Do you see that phase coming when we'll move from consumerism to a socially engaged class?
It's possible, and the middle class, I think, because it's an intelligent class, will do it in its own interests. The first signs are already there. Many of you will remember the Jessica Lal case, where for the first time across the urban sprawl of India, the middle class came together to protest what it saw as a manifest abuse of the system of justice. You saw it again in the explosive protests at the time of Nirbhaya. Increasingly now, there is a new sense of at least their localized neighborhood in resident welfare associations, all of which are strengthened by new instruments of instant communication. So it may happen, it could happen. My point of view is that it should happen more and it should happen faster in the interests of the middle class itself. You will be surprised how big a market rural India is, Shoma.
Yeah.
Just simple things, fans, watches, motorcycles, taps, sanitary ware, shampoo sachets, soaps.
Yeah, but
how much sells in rural India? And so the middle class must have a stake in the progress of the country as a whole, rather than merely pockets of growth in an ocean of poverty.
Thank you very much, Pavan. We'll open this up to the audience. There were a couple of questions I wanted to pose to him still, but I'm very aware that you have an award ceremony coming up and we don't want to take up too much of your time. One was this question about violence and communalism. Started the session with sharing that story about the young boy who thought making history was really at the opening of a Zara shop. That's how far we've moved in idea of what makes history. The other, I don't know if all of you noticed, it was, I think, a Times of India story about a very recent anecdote in Delhi where somebody just bumped into a dog and there was an altercation between the two sets of people and they stabbed this man to death for not saying sorry to the dog. That's how much latent anger lies just beneath the surface, and whether this middle class has a capacity for violence which is terrifying and which one should engage with. And the last point was whether Rakesh Mehra, who made Rang De Basanti before the Jessica Lal story flared up, he used this phrase where he said he believes that the Indian middle class are sleeping idealists, and you really just have to light the spark and that idealism will kick in. But, these are questions that you can perhaps chat with Pavan after the session. Let's open it up for questions and, then we can end the session. It's time up with many exclamation marks. So we'll cut off the questions totally. I'm sorry. I'll obey that. I understand power when I see it. So thank you very much for listening in. Pavan has other views on the middle class, which there wasn't time to espouse. Thank you very much for being here.